Thanks, Tom, and I'd like to thank Steve and the whole department for inviting me down here. Thank you for all coming. Entomology and Purdue has a very special place in my heart, and it's a privilege to talk here today to share a little bit of my experience. And I thought I might start today, once I take care of my dry mouth. That remind you of Rubio at all? Tom just showed you one end of the rainbow, and I thought you might be interested in the other end of the rainbow. Last year, you'll hear I ran for office. So these are some candidate pictures off my Facebook, and the hair's a little whiter. Volunteers, signs, public events. I also marched in 3 parades, and I knocked on a lot of doors. So that's the other end of the rainbow. I started out here as an entomology student, and somehow I ended up at this end of the rainbow running for office. But I want to talk about a little bit broader subject, about what I perceive as the great divide, a rift between scientists and legislators. And I think from the get-go I should say, you know, what right do I have to speak to a room full of scientists? You know, I'm an entomologist turned lawyer and a recent political candidate. So what right? Well, yes, this once young man, Dr. Turpin, trained as a scientist, is now a politician, and that's a path begun in 1977 as I left Purdue for law school. And a few of us old enough to remember Star Wars premiered in 1977, and as I sat in the theater and heard Yoda, I wondered if he was speaking to me when he said, "Once you start down the dark path, forever will it dominate your destiny, consume you it will." But I think Yoda got it wrong in regard to science and the arena of politics. There is a duality, but it's not impossible to do both, scientist and politician. And in fact, by definition, science is political. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. Despite that, there's a great divide today, a rift between scientists and legislators. And that's why I'm here today, to ask, what can we as scientists, and enough of me is still a scientist that I feel justified in including myself, what can we do as scientists about the divorce of science from policy decisions? But first, talking about the rainbow, what was my trajectory from science to politics? So in 1976, I was a young scientist finishing my master's in Old Ent Hall. My thesis, as Tom mentioned, concerned the efficacy of biological control of a braconid endoparasite of the black cutworm. And the results would be used in Tom's integrated pest management model for corn. Although I was born in Indiana, I lived in Wisconsin since 3rd grade, and I loved biology in high school in Wisconsin. Later at Valparaiso University, I chose a major in biology over history and became fascinated with entomology while doing work study under Dr. Carl Kreckler. He had to do something with me, and he had about 10 years worth of light trap collections that had never been sorted. So I spent 2 semesters sorting through the collections, and I learned so much doing that that I became interested in pursuing entomology. He urged me to apply for a graduate position under Dr. Turpin, and so I arrived here in Purdue in 1974, and then finishing my thesis, I kind of felt like I had become a young entomology Jedi. Okay? So I considered field work, pursuing a doctorate, working as a scientist for the EPA, but Emperor the Dark Emperor Osman and Darth Vader Turpin turned me to the dark side. And in the fall of 1977, I enrolled in Indiana University's law school to talk about the dark side. To call Dr. Osman the Dark Emperor and Dr. Turpin Darth Vader, well, that's not really accurate. At least I think they thought of themselves as Yoda and Obi-Wan, sending their young entomologist Jedi out to clean out the EPA. Dr. Osman, and some of you will remember this, had been a deputy director at the EPA when it was first formed in the early 70s. And he said that those in charge of creating and enforcing regulations, and FIFRA had just been enacted and was a hot topic while I was in grad school. He said the people in charge of creating and enforcing regulations knew nothing about science. And I learned that for myself. As a graduate student, I was told to drive up to the Indianapolis airport to pick up 2 EPA lawyers to come and speak at the Pest Control Operators Conference. And I listened in to them as I drove, and I discovered that they knew and cared a lot more about skiing in Vermont than they did about science. Now, Dr. Osman's proposal to go to law school had tapped into a natural predilection in my character. You know, my love of science had been matched by my desire to impact public policy. Until Dr. Osman spoke to me, my limited experiential view of science led me to believe that scientists had little or no role in policy making, unless, like Dr. Osman, they stepped out of academia and entered the public arena. So I had envisioned my future from a perspective of duality. The force and the dark side. As a scientist, I would be pure, being locked within the confines of the ivory tower, or I could fling off the mantle of scientific impartiality and plunge into public debate. Dr. Osman's and Dr. Turpin suggested it could be both. So I went to Indiana University and pursued environmental and administrative law. But the force was not with me at first. With growing family obligations, I had a daughter, and an inability to find the right post in the right city after law school that would utilize both my science and my legal training, I ended up returning to Wisconsin and a small law firm. So I left, if you would, the star system of science for the most part, but I kept up my interest in it, reading popular science books, doing insects as food talk that Dr. Turpin developed, sometimes talking about entomology with classes, and occasionally taking on a legal case that required my scientific analysis ability and knowledge. And then for 26 months, as Dr. Turpin mentioned, in 2008 to the beginning of 2010, I was a Peace Corps volunteer, and I had a chance to combine policy and science as I worked for the Romanian Environmental Protection Agency. You know, but for the most part, I had a very active, non-scientific life in the community. As an attorney, as a leader of a Kiwanis club, on various community and city boards, and in political campaigning. This culminated last year when nearly all of my time was occupied with a run for a state legislative office. I'll tell you a little bit about that. I ran as a Democrat in a district that had only elected Republicans for the last 4 generations. And in the prior cycle, the prior election cycle, the Republican had no opponent at all. And I just didn't feel that was right. I think voters deserve a choice even in a gerrymandered district. So I ran, and I ran in a way that I hoped would allow me to win. Now let me describe campaigning a little bit. Have any of you ever campaigned for office? Okay. It isn't voodoo. There's actually a science to it. But I'll give you a little bit about what a year of campaigning is all about. you do need to research issues. So every morning I spent a couple hours reading the news and op-ed pieces. You build a steering committee. My committee was a dozen friends who had experience in local affairs. One was a press secretary, one with market analysis, another one running social media pages. We met monthly at first and then weekly. We developed a team of volunteers and maintained the volunteers, which takes a lot of time and hand-holding. With the help of consultants, we designed yard signs and mailings. Vote Builder program is used to identify voters who should be contacted. And by the time I finished, I had knocked on over 7,000 doors. And I did that nearly every afternoon. I wore out 2 pairs of shoes. There's scores of public events to appear in the evenings, and that's something I actually enjoyed along with knocking doors, the person-to-person contact. And I marched in parades, as I said. Position papers needed to be written and letters to the editor organized. Social media counts today too, so I was on Facebook daily. I even tweeted once in a while. And of course, none of this happens without money. So all my free time was spent talking to donors, and by the time I finished, I had raised $32,000, something that was very foreign to me doing. What I didn't raise was the final 2,600 votes that I needed to win. Okay? But maybe next time. Now, my scientific training was not without value to the campaign. Analysis of the electorate is now crucial to victory, owing in Wisconsin to the very equally divided but also very polarized electorate. And to do it well takes precision, scientific and statistical approach. Budgets also dominated voters' concerns this last election, and my comfort with numbers and objective comparisons, I think, provided a competency on financial issues that the voters understood and appreciated. In many policy issues in Wisconsin, from wind turbine effects on human health, to non-point pollution from dairy farm operations, to ferrous mining by open pit techniques in northern Wisconsin, all involved science and technical issues. And those are issues that I could understand and I think could convey in an understandable manner to voters. And I thought another important thing about my candidacy was that my training as a scientist, and you will all appreciate this having done research, my training as a scientist gave me a long-range outlook, whereas almost every politician seems to measure time by election cycles. And for policy purposes, measuring things by election cycles I don't think is productive. Running for elective office also brought me to 4 realizations related to science. 1, science and technology are involved in almost every legal enactment these days. 2, scientists have little impact on these policy decisions. 3, there are almost no legislators with scientific training. And 4, the public in many legislators are actually anti-science. Yet the majority of our policy decisions are challenges that the government must tackle to meet our pressing societal needs, revolve around what's been called the SEEP challenges. That's science, economic, environment, and population. As to how scientific information is relevant to these policy challenges, and to what extent values should trump facts, well, there's a great divide between scientists, I think, and legislators. The climate change debate is an example of this divide. In May last year, Scientific American reported that a group of North Carolinian legislators from 20 coastal counties found the meter or so of sea level rise predicted by a state-appointed board of scientists extremely inconvenient to their development-minded donors. So what did they do? The legislators in Replacement House Bill 819 made it against the law to use data from before 1900 and to measure sea level rise exponentially. You have to do it linearly according to those legislators. So let me go back to something I said earlier. I said science is political, and that's something that wasn't intuitive to me. But Sean Lawrence Otto has written an excellent book on science and politics titled Fool Me Twice, Fighting the Assault on Science in America. Has anybody read that, this group? I would recommend it. He writes, at its core, science is a reliable method for creating knowledge and thus power. Because science pushes the boundaries of knowledge, it pushes us to constantly refine our ethics and morality, and that is always political. But beyond that, science constantly disrupts hierarchical power structures and vested interests in a long drive to give knowledge and thus power to the individual. And that process is political. Yet there are almost no scientists in our federal legislature. And I'll give you some statistics on this. So if you look at all levels of higher education degrees, in 2008, there were only 6 congressmen with training in biological science in our federal Congress. That's the same Congress where over 100 members did not believe in evolution. Sean Lawrence Otto in his book reports that in November of 2010, when the political tide swept in a new class of 87 freshman GOP representatives and 13 GOP senators, that's a total of 100, 94 of those 100 new lawmakers either denied climate change, signed the pledge to reject cap and trade, or signed the No Climate Tax pledge promoting Americans for prosperity. I'm using some GOP examples, but I know plenty of Democrats who have the exact same problem. It's endemic on both sides of the aisle. Here's some more statistics. In March of 2011, it was reported that there was then exactly 1 scientist with a doctoral degree in the entire 535 members of the U.S. Congress, and that was New Jersey's Rush Holt, particle physicist. That's down from 2008, and in the Congress which just ended, it only included 1 physicist, 1 chemist, 6 engineers, and 1 microbiologist. And this extends down to the state level. The Chronicle of Higher Education found in 2001 that while the vast majority of state legislators did go to college, most stayed close to home and attended a community college, and about 1 in 4 didn't have a bachelor's degree. I can't tell you how many of them studied science. I didn't have those statistics. Now, I feel that this divide has been accelerated by the media. You've all seen that the media has reduced its coverage of science. It's shifted from evaluating the truth-saying of respondents to seeking and reporting controversy, sometimes over scientific issues where there should be no controversy. Here's an example. The LA Times headlined a report on the insecticide DDVP as, quote, controversial insecticide allowed to stay on market, end quote. And within the article, the Natural Resources Defense Counsel's attorney, and I don't have anything against attorneys, but that attorney's statements were given the same probative weight as the decisions of the EPA. And the statements of both sides were unchallenged by the reporter, and no independent scientific opinion was provided. And when I read it, what the story ended up as being was one of a potentially frightful chemical related to, quote, World War II era nerve agents, end quote, and of environmental groups versus colluding industry and governmental officials. Now, Wired Science did a little better reporting on a recent study of insecticides' possible effect on bee colony collapse, but they still couldn't resist captioning the article as controversy deepens. So why is this media failure? I don't have any detailed answers, but in part, I've been told by reporters that they have neither the training nor the resources to probe and expose scientific truth. And why should they bother when controversy sells better than facts? But we also, remembering that science has a political message whether we want it or not, have to ask, why? Because discussed earlier, science is all about giving knowledge and thus power to the individual. And because science pushes the boundaries of knowledge, it pushes people to constantly refine their ethics and morality. And this can threaten groups that have their power vested in beliefs that scientific discoveries challenge, such as the oil and coal industry being threatened by evidence of a causal link between burning fossil fuels and global warming. They have two choices. They can say, oh yes, you're right, we're going to dismantle our industry, or they can challenge the science. And sometimes these groups use techniques that are really underhanded. Otto says there's a five-pronged strategy to subvert scientific evidence in policy debates. First, the group threatened by scientific research promulgates phony science. Next, they feed the mainstream media with canned blogs and press stories that create a controversy narrative based on the phony silence. Then they use this laundered narrative to catalyze an outrage and calls for policy change by partisan talk radio and cable news. The fourth step, according to Otto, occurs when government allies of the vested interests react to the fomented rage by proposing, quote, reasoned corrective responses, and then the scenario ends with the instigators of the subterfuge stepping forward as aggrieved patriots to lobby the people and the legislators to do something about this threatening policy change. As scientists, we can't and we wouldn't use such tactics. We're not going to go over to the dark side. However, by understanding the strategy of those who would deny science, we can be proactive and protective in building our case for scientifically merited policy change. So whether manipulated by interest groups or out of inherent disabilities and inclinations, the media's focus on controversy, presenting each side as championing different values of equal scientific validity, or worse yet, that the science-generated results themselves are relative to a specific viewpoint and therefore not concrete, creates what Otto calls the media marketplace of ideas. Think of it this way: in the media marketplace, every theory is presented as a different but equally nutritious fruit to be selected from the produce stand solely on personal preference. And this harm is compounded by a growing science illiteracy. That also brings to light an additional psychological phenomena that as scientists, I think we need to be aware of. This phenomenon widens this great divide. Scientists, as you know from your training and experience, your personal training experience, we set aside emotions and political values to carry out careful, detailed consideration of the evidence. As a result, science should and does provide clear pictures of how to solve our great challenges. Yet, as Otto points out, policymakers are increasingly unwilling to pursue many of the remedies that science presents. Why can't we be heard? Well, as scientists, we're trained to avoid rhetorical arguments. So we prize the intellectual honesty because we know how prejudices and value judgments can blind us to the truth we're seeking as scientists. Introducing subjective feelings to your research is the surest way you can end your career as a scientist. We also, I think, have bought into the belief that politics taint us in that very way. Daniel Greenberg, who authored Science, Money, and Politics, believes that all efforts to promote direct involvement of scientists in policies that are held back by the widespread belief in scientific circles that such activity is inappropriate for serious researchers and taints their objectivity. I've heard a couple of people today talking to me saying that very thing, that they didn't believe they could get involved in science because it was anathema to being in policy, because it was anathema to being a scientist. So while we fear prejudices and value judgments, the general public looks to something other than just facts in their decision making, and we forget that a lot of times. The lay public, according to Otto, does just the opposite of us. They form frames of references, prejudices, and value judgments as guides for navigating life. So not facts, but these values are what they use to figure out what to do. And then they make rhetorical arguments to get what they need. It ends up with the thinking of what feels good is good. Very relative. It's not that the public does not have scientific knowledge. And sometimes we think that's what the issue is, but it's not just that. Oftentimes they do have knowledge, or at least have access to it. In a Pew Research Center survey in 2008, found that more educated Republicans, the more Republicans were educated, the less they believed in climate change. And I can tell you that about Democrats too on issues. And then here's another study. I found this one really interesting and I think informative to how we present our information to the public. It's a study of the lay public's subjectivity towards scientific information and how when information on a specific issue conflicts with their value system, the effect has a wide-ranging impact on their view of science. Psychologist Jeffrey Monroe, in a 2010 study, asked subjects a politically charged question. He asked them, do you believe that homosexuality is a mental illness? He did this to separate the groups. He got a yes group and he got a no group. And he presented each group with fake scientific studies, half of which presented conclusions that confirmed a group's prejudice, and half of which that contradicted their belief. Regardless of their position on the question, those who were presented with fake studies that confirmed their belief tended to ignore the study's weaknesses, and those who were presented with studies that contradicted their beliefs were very adept at finding the weaknesses in the work. What's even more concerning to us who care about the integrity of science and the importance of scientific information in policymaking was Monroe discovered that subjects who read fake studies that contradicted their belief were also more likely to conclude that science was impotent to settle the question. When Monroe asked the subjects questions about their opinions on other social-political issues that science did have information that could help solve, he found that the subjects felt now that science was less likely to be able to solve any issue at all. So in other words, it's not enough for we scientists to get out there and share facts. Without proper framing, we might actually make the situation worse. And even without us doing more harm than good through ignoring the framing of our information, the media marketplace of ideas itself triggers the layperson's emotional reaction to any science that contradicts his or her belief, thereby spreading and enhancing the conviction that science is impotent to solve the SEEP problems. So I think as scientists we must understand that some misconceptions about science are not about knowledge deficits, but of belief resistance created by social experiences. And we need to learn ways to short-circuit these processes. So what do I mean by framing? Framing is using language that allows the listener to identify with you and your values. Now, it's not compromise of the facts. It's not compromise of the outcome you're seeking. It's not compromise of your own personal values. But think of this, liberal and conservative, city dwellers and rural folk, even scientists and lawyers, we all share more values than we don't share. Conservatives and liberals alike, for example, want the country to be a safer and more prosperous place for their grandchildren. Clothe your argument with that value, address your facts toward that goal, and the listener is more likely to be receptive. You know, relate your message to a position that threatens one of the listener's values, or tell him or her they're wrong because they don't understand or know the facts like you do, and you've put up a wall. You're not going to get through that door. And not only that, but you may have made them believe that all science is untrustworthy. So how did I handle this out on the campaign trail? Because as I said, in the Wisconsin election, there were plenty of issues that came up, both national, I was quizzed on a lot of national issues, and state. And one of them that came up was global warming. So I could kind of tell the door that I was going to, because we also cut turfs, but turfs were lists of doors to knock on, and I'd have information about those voters. So if I went to a door where I had a suspicion of what their value system was, and if it was a value system that was anti-global warming, I didn't speak about the dangers of global warming for the environment. Instead, I spoke of responsibility we owe our families to not produce more CO2 than necessary when we could not be sure of its effect. Protection of their family was their overriding value frame, and I needed to be able to step into that frame to be heard. And I could do that without compromising my belief that we should reduce CO2 production by, instead of talking about how important the environment is and got to hug those trees, talking about protecting their families. A little simple change, but allowed me to have a conversation. And so as scientists in public policy debates, we have a responsibility to learn how to frame our message in a manner that will be heard. But I'm coming to one of my last points. First, we must be able to be in the public forum. And the primary thing that I believe that keeps scientists out of politics is that our careers, as they're currently constructed, are not compatible with it. Now, as an attorney, especially a self-employed attorney, I could take the time off that it took to campaign for a state-level office. And that was a year. I spent most of my time campaigning during that year. And I could do it with the assurance that if unsuccessful, I could pick up my career again just where I left it off. And in fact, I was fairly certain that the contacts I made and the publicity I got as a candidate would actually help my practice if I returned to it. But as career scientists, you face, I think, the opposite situation. You can't take the time off to run for or to hold office without basically giving up your careers. You must constantly keep up with research in order to maintain your scientific edge. If you leave for half a year to run for office, you can't expect there to be a job when you come back. A hiatus to plunge into politics can derail you from the tenure track. And in the eyes of your fellow scientists, you may well come back tainted by politics. And even now I can see that some people are still wondering whether I'm in the dark side yet. But I think those are things that impact on all of you going out and doing public service. And in the seminar this afternoon, at lunchtime, we talked about scientists are not different than anybody else in the public. We care about our country. We care about these issues. Yet there are things that block us from becoming as involved as we'd like to. So what I'm suggesting is Our scientific societies, Association of University Scientists, and industry groups with research programs need to decide as a community to create a climate where scientists can enter the political arena. It would make all the difference if we were guaranteed the opportunity of at least a 6-month sabbatical to run for office, and especially if a living stipend would be provided by our professional associations during that sabbatical. It would help tremendously if a percentage of staff positions could be reserved at universities, national labs, and technological corporations for scientists completing political service. And how many more scientists would be willing to run if they're kept in the tenure stream? And there are programs already that are seeking to involve scientists in policy debates. The National Academy of Science now has a Science Ambassador program in which researchers will be recruited and trained to speak out on their areas of expertise. There's a nonprofit group called Scientists and Engineers for America, and they now offer guidance and encouragement to researchers considering a run for political office, all the way from school board up to Congress. And in 2011, Dr. Vernon Ehlers, a physicist then in Congress, and Dr. Foster, a science elected to Congress from Illinois, they formed a bipartisan pact called Franklin's List, kind of like Emily's List that helps encourage and promote women in politics. But Ben Franklin's List goal was to offer engineers and scientists the credibility, training, and money they needed to win office. And the American Association for Advancement of Science now offers fellowships that put new PhD researchers in congressional offices and federal agencies. And another example, the Aldo Leopold Leadership Program offers environmental researchers training in how to communicate with policymakers and the public. So, what should you do about the Great Divide? Well, obviously be informed on public policy debates so that you know what's being said. Speak out in the public forum on scientific evidence that impacts on policy decisions. Letters to the editor, guest columnists to the newspaper, radio talk shows, speaking to groups, service groups like the Kiwanis Club. Anytime you have an opportunity to talk about science in a situation where you can relate to the listeners in a positive way, that promotes a scientific understanding of facts involved in policy issues. Understand that when you do these presentations of scientific information to the public, science is political. It's not neutral, because knowledge can challenge existing beliefs and prejudice. Therefore, you must try to frame your message in a way that is relevant to the political process and public values. I'd encourage you to work within your scientific societies and the university for policies that are friendly to scientists participating in policy debate and for those who run for office. Undertake that training on how to speak on scientific issues in a way that the public will be receptive to. Maybe that even helps talking to your spouse. And run for office. And may the force be with you. So, thank you very much.